racism and systemic racism in this country. And we are so clearly not post-racial. It was actually harder to do the work that I do during the Obama years, because that's what you were up against. President Obama shows how post-racial we are. I don't think anyone is in denial about that. I would say that the presidency of Obama gave racism a huge infusion of legitimacy, to a degree that it looks to me like pre-civil rights era of explicit social permission at the highest levels of government to express explicit racism. So just wanted to speak to that context that we're having this conversation in, and so glad to be with you, Ron, and the rest of the group.
Thank you, Robin. Very, very interesting remarks. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of time to unpack and to have you expound on some of those thoughts and ideas. Why don't we start by, you just kind of giving us an overview as to, how you've come, to this topic, right? Tell us a little bit kind of about yourself and, how this has become an area of focus for you for the last several years.
Sure. I don't think that my life was set up in a way specifically as a white person that I would be ever involved in this topic. Just following the trajectory laid out for most white people, we don't have authentic, sustained cross-racial relationships. Most of us live our lives in segregation, and are given relentless messages that is preferable to integration. And I spent most of my life, like most white people, unable to tell you what it even meant to be white. I didn't see myself in racial terms. I saw you in racial terms. And I expected if we're going to be talking about race, we'd be talking about you, not me.
Right.
Now, several decades later, I'm so clear that I am white, that it is as profound in my life as it may be in yours. And it happened in some ways as a fluke. I applied for a job that I wasn't qualified for, but hey, I'm white. I got the job. And it was as a diversity trainer in the early 90s. And I think two key pieces of that is that I thought that, well, I'm an open-minded person. I'm a good person, a nice person. I'm not racist. I'm progressive. So that automatically qualifies me to be able to go in and teach other people to be like me. And I thought it was going to be really fun. I mean, who doesn't enjoy these conversations? And I'm saying that to show how naive I was. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I can interject. So had your training and background up to that point, was it at least logical that you did receive a job as a diversity trainer?
I was an educator. I think it was clear from the way that I talked that I believed in social justice, but in those very big, vague terms. And so when somebody told me about this position, I read it. I'd never heard of diversity trainer. It sounded cool, and that was the most profound learning of my life. Two levels. One, we were paired, so we were working side by side with people of color who were challenging the way that I saw the world.
And about how long ago was that? How many years ago
was that? It was in the early 90s, mid 90s. Mm-hmm. So what, more than 20 years ago?
Yeah, almost 30 years.
I mean, part of being white is I could be that far in life. I was in my 30s. I was a college educated, the whole thing. And I had never in my life had my racial worldview challenged, and certainly not by people of color in any sustained way. So that was the fish out of water kind of experience. The other part was going in the workplace, oftentimes completely white, 100% white. And white people would be out of their minds with anger and defensiveness and outrage and complaining bitterly about affirmative action. And, you're standing there trying to make sense of it all. Now, years later, because it's so repetitive and predictable, in many ways, it's like a script, right? You can just say, oh, I know what they're going to say now. I just got better and better and better at speaking back to it, at challenging it. And then I went on to get my PhD in critical whiteness studies. So I'm one of those people who went from practice to theory,
Right.
unlike a lot of academics who go from theory to practice. And so I've been speaking out and writing about it ever since.
Very, very, very interesting. So in your studies, right, have you had the opportunity to look at other cultures and look at this kind of racial dynamic from other cultural and historical perspectives outside of the United States? And if so, has it been kind of helpful or insightful in any way?
Yeah, not so much outside of the United States, right? So when I did my scholarship and my experience has been rooted in the U.S., the history of the U.S. But at this point, I presented my work outside the U.S., and my book is being printed in 10 different languages at this point. And what I can tell you is that everywhere I go outside of the US, white people pull me aside and say, we don't have those issues here. Racism is a American problem. You don't know our culture. And in every one of those places, Black people pull me aside and say, thank goodness you're here. Please talk to these white people. Everything you describe is what we experience. The outcomes are the same. Sure, there are different historical and cultural nuances, but again, the dynamics and the outcomes are consistent. So what I'd say now when I go outside the US context is it's on the white person listening to make those translations, but not to dismiss the analysis out of hand. And I recognize that this is a complex issue that, I'm not ever going to be able to do justice to in my lifetime, but that's basically how I handle translating what my work into
Cultural differences, right?
Yeah.
I've read your book, of course, and when I read some of the statements, right, and having kind of grown up in the South, interacted with a lot of white people, some of the statements that you make, I'm struck because I'm kind of anticipating or thinking like, wow, how would people respond to this, right? And so in thinking about it, I kind of concluded that definitions is really important, right? Because if you're not working from the same definitional standpoint, right, there's nothing but misunderstanding and offense, and it's just not productive. So can you define like some of the key terms that get kind of thrown around, like what is racism, what is white supremacy, what is systemic racism, and what is racist? Like, what does that mean, right? So that we're kind of on the same page, at least for this discussion.
Yeah, I'd love to. And that is so foundational, because if we're not even using the same terms in the same way, we're like this. And this is one of the dynamics that holds systemic racism in place, is that we don't understand what it is. So absolutely everyone has bias. There's no human objectivity. We all absorb stereotypes and misinformation about social others. The research in implicit bias is clear, and I just assume most people at this point understand that. I highly recommend Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt's new book called Bias, where she pulls that research together. But in the case of racial bias, racism happens when one group's collective racial bias is backed with legal authority and institutional control. That transforms it into a far-reaching system that moves beyond the individual, moves beyond the individual's intentions, awareness. It doesn't depend on whether I agree with it or believe in it or even admit to it. It's the default of the very society and all of its institutions. So it's being reproduced automatically, 365, right, 24/7. And that is so critical, right? That difference between your bias that you may have towards me and mine towards you. Your group is not able to enact legislation that literally limits the rights of my group, but my group can do that to you. That's the difference. And I often use women's suffrage as the example. Women could be upset with men all they wanted, but only men could grant them their civil rights to vote. They couldn't grant those rights to themselves, and they certainly couldn't take away men's right to vote, right? That difference. And of course, since we're on that, let me be really clear that we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And of course, which women were granted full access to the right to vote in 1920, and which men gave it to us. White women were granted that access and white men gave it to us. So that's an example of being oppressed as a woman and still privileged as white, still having my white experience stand in as universal. So we just say women were granted the right to vote when, that's not actually true. And of
Right.
course,
It would have been 1965 before Black women would have gotten that privilege.
And
across the board anyway.
I'm going to assume everyone's paying attention that absolutely no gains can ever be taken for granted. Look where we are. Okay, so that's the difference between prejudice and systemic racism. And that is why I talk about the racial prejudice of white people. I call that racism. The prejudice or bias of people of color, I call prejudice or bias. Mm-hmm. In that sense, there is no reverse racism. Mm-hmm. It's not a fluid system.
Right. And how do you go from racism, right, which I understand is basically, prejudice and racial discrimination that's backed up by authority, legal authority, force, whatever the case may be, but it's the power to enforce, those prejudices, right, yes, across the society. And then from there, how do you get to white supremacy, or is it the same thing?
I do tend to use them interchangeably. We might say we begin with white supremacy and then the system that develops from it. So white supremacy, and let me acknowledge, I grew up understanding that as a very charged term. That referred to people that would wear white hoods. Mm-hmm. Today, I understand that while it would include people who would wear white hoods, it's a highly descriptive sociological term for the society we live in, for the culture we live in, a culture that holds white people up as the standard for human, as the ideal standard for human, and everyone else is measured against that ideal standard, and of course always comes up deficient. And I think an example of even white women were the standard for women, even though we didn't represent all women. So right. White supremacy is also circulating throughout the culture. I'm just going to be bold now. No one misses absorbing the ideology of white supremacy. I mean, the impact is different on you than on me, but we both absorb that ideology. And so we can think of systemic racism as a system that gets built from that essential belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so pervasive that we just take it as a given. We've grown up in it, we've imbibed it, and that's pretty much like all we know for the most part. It's interesting. I was talking to my daughter, who is 8, the other day, and well, she was talking to me. She's years old, and she just asked me whether I'd noticed that most of the voices on TV, the commercials, were white voices. Right. And I said, well, how do you know they're white voices? She said, well, because I know, and sometimes I see them, right? And one, I wondered why she asked that, why that was something to notice. And then two, of course, I was proud that she was so insightful. But then it made me think like, okay, well, what message or what impact, right, is it that if all your life, right, that's kind of what you're experiencing, right? If you're not seeing some proportion of so-called Black voices, in positions of authority, selling good things or, spreading knowledge and all of those types of things, I kind of think that you kind of walk away thinking that, well, the source of all those things, right, is white. And somehow or another, I think it's related to that principle of universalism. Yep. That you kind of alluded to a second ago.
Yeah, the research does show that children by age 3 to 4 understand that it's better to be white in this society. They learn that and absorb that message really early. I think pretty much all of us knew really young that it's better to be white. And that isn't an isolated message, right? It's not dependent on some mean person said something someday. It's just constantly, like heroes, heroines, role models, the assumption, who's put in front of us, who are the teachers, who runs the country, and so on. And so when we don't talk to children about that, when we proceed as if they're innocent of those messages, we leave them unattended. They have no way to resist those messages. But I do want to say one thing, and there's some, I don't want to split hairs, but I'm not sure really what came first in terms of white supremacy or racism, but Ta-Nehisi Coates has a beautiful quote where he says, racism is the parent and race is the child. And what I understand that is, we tend to think of, like, if people see difference, and because they're different, then we fear them or whatever. And he's like, no. The way that racism worked is, first you had a group of people who had resources you wanted, and you had the means to exploit those resources. And then you made up a story to justify exploiting those resources. So in that way, we could say the system of racism came, and then we made up the ideology of white supremacy to support it. For anybody who that kind of distinction is important for, I just wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's like some historical evidence of that, right? You can look at kind of the doctrine of racial superiority and all of that, and it kind of started like in the I guess the 1900s or so, where it really started to kind of take on a life of its own, and you had the scientific racism and all those things. But that was after, when the exploitation really had started on a large scale. So the exploitation kind of started first, and then you had this rationale, this justifying rationale to kind of keep it going, right? But so we understand, we have this scourge of racism, which has got us to a place where we call white supremacy. How does your work, contribute to kind of tackling that, or trying to mitigate or dismantle, or do you even think it's possible to dismantle?
I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. And I've always felt that, but I particularly feel it now. But I would like to ameliorate some of the harm that is done from myself and my fellow white people. I would, we have seen some things that matter change, the Confederate flags being taken away and so forth. These are not minor. They're deeply symbolic in a way that has an impact. But no, we're not anywhere near there. So when I think about it, I think about, we have white supremacy as white as the ideal for humanity. Whiteness is all of the dynamics that go together to support that idea. And then white privilege is one of the results, one of the outcomes of being in a system where white people are seen as the ideal. And then I think what I'm adding is, and white fragility is what erupts when any of that is named or questioned. When that feels like it is under threat, then white fragility erupts as a way to push the threat back, to refuse that, to protect the status quo and the white position within it.
And therein lies the harm, right?
Absolutely. I actually think white fragility is a form of bullying. I do think we tend to make it so punitive for you to try to challenge us on these dynamics that most of the time, people of color said to me, they take home way more of those slights and indignities on a daily basis than they bother speaking back to, because all too often it's just worse if you try to challenge it. So just put up with it. And so it ends up being a very powerful form of social control to keep you in your place. Certainly you can be with us as long as you don't challenge us, right? I'm wondering if that rings true for your experience.
I tend to say what I want to say, so it doesn't act in that way for me. If I feel like I need to say it, I'll say it. Okay. But I understand I'm probably not the norm, right? But just tacking onto what what you said there. I mean, certainly there are, for lack of better word, some anti-racist white people, some good white people who may be somewhat fragile, right? When it comes to this topic or being approached, with this subject matter, right? And they don't regard it as being fragile. So they want to engage and they want to, kind of have an impact, mitigate, ameliorate, or even dismantle, right? Um, what can they do? What, I mean, what are you saying to them, right? To that person who kind of wants to be a positive contributor.
Yeah, well, often if the worry, right, if there's some kind of worry there, then that can result in carefulness. Better not to take this risk and say anything than risk saying the wrong thing. It can result in silence, and those things are not going to move forward project of racial justice. So when you change the way you think about what it means to collude with racists and be part of this system, when you understand that it's inevitable, I'm a good person, I'm committed to racial justice, but it's inevitable that I'm also a product of my socialization, and on occasion it's going to come out, it's going to come through. I'm going to step on that toe or say that thing or and act in that way. And that's your opportunity to learn and grow and change and do better. If we don't make those mistakes, we're likely not going to change and grow. So be thoughtful, but not necessarily careful. I don't see it as a issue of good or bad people.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of what makes us so sensitive about it as white people, is that we're taught to think of a racist as a really bad person, an immoral person who openly hates people based on race and would want to cause them harm. And that pretty much exempts most white people, honestly. If it has to be conscious and intentional, I think pretty much we're going to all be exempted, and yet look at our society and look at our outcomes. So when you see it as an inevitable dynamic, you're going to approach your situations very differently.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, to be devil's advocate, right? I mean, it's hard to look at, just history, right? Um, of, slavery in particular, Jim Crow, all of these, really just unrestrained acts of racial hatred toward Black folk, right? And you use that, word, oh, they were, clearly racist. And then you use the same terminology for people today who, in some ways, were born into a system, right, that they don't have control over. So necessarily they pick up some quote racist attributes, right?
Mhm.
But you use that same word.
Mhm.
So isn't it like to be expected, really, that when you use that word, that they would react, in that context, if you're using the word, the same way that they would react if you were accusing them of all those past acts. I'm trying to get into the mind and trying to understand, like, why is it so hard to kind of get past it and just say, let's talk about now and not get hung up on the emotional part of it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and certainly I'm sure it's on people's minds. And it keeps going back to this idea that it's an either or. You're either a racist or
Mhm.
you're not a racist. And if you're a racist, you're a bad person. And if you're not racist, you're a good person. And we can see that hasn't resolved racism. And I think of it as a continuum we're all on. And we move along that continuum in different moments. In some moments, I am behaving in more anti-racist ways, but there are moments when I choose comfort and silence, and then I'm in a different spot on that continuum. And if you think about it like that, you will always look for, okay, of course, I'm not an explicit, what I call avowed racist, but I play a part. What is that part? And then how can I play a stronger part towards justice? Right now, because we think about it as an either or, people who don't see themselves as racist also don't tend to see this as their problem. They don't get involved in efforts to challenge it. They're not racist. And so they carry on, and that inadvertently supports the status quo, which is racism. And here I have to quote Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who says, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. And so I understand his point to be, if the default is racism and you're not doing anything to challenge it, you are participating in it. Right. So anti-racist becomes a verb rather than a noun. So I do think that if we open up our understanding of these issues, you're going to get less of like, you're putting me in that box. No, where I'm putting you on a continuum, which is, even that is challenging, because I'm not allowing a spot for you to say you are free of all this. I just don't believe it's possible for any white person to be free of all racial misinformation, prejudice, racist ideology. That's not realistic, but that is how we proceed, as if it is possible.
Yeah, I
that
think the
we've been
spectrum
untouched.
helps. I think understanding it as a spectrum,
Yeah.
really helps a lot,
Yeah.
right? I think it's probably, accurate, reflection of reality. Yes. Jenny, do we have any questions from the audience at this point?
We do. We have about 5 so far. You want me to get started on them?
Can I? Well, yeah, I'm not going to screen them. Why don't you use your discretion and
Okay.
and insert the questions at this point? Because
While she's
Okay, this one.
while she's looking through those, Ron, can I say something about guilt? Because that's probably a little bit in the
Sure.
conversation we're having right now.
Sure.
It's certainly been something that I would say is a misread of my work. And that is, it's natural to have some feelings of guilt when you come to awareness that this is a system and I'm in it and I am part of it and I have contributed to it in some ways. But the key is you have to move through that, or it becomes an excuse to not engage.
Right.
And I think when you understand it as a system and you're in on a continuum or spectrum, it really helps with guilt. I really don't struggle with guilt. I don't find it remotely constructive or useful. But I do feel responsible for having been conditioned this way. And I think it's on me as an adult now to continually try to identify how I was conditioned and how that might be manifesting in my life and my relationships.
Right. Okay, Jenny.
Okay, so I really like this question because I feel like it applies to me. What is your advice for white liberal women who think we are helping, but we are really hurting? How do we see those blind spots?
I have a couple different thoughts. And one is, I hope that you have demonstrated that you would be open to somebody helping you see those blind spots. If you're pretty sure you have them, but nobody's giving you that feedback, it could be that you have somehow, indicated that you would be defensive, or that you would kind of explain what you really meant, that type of thing. So think about that. And also just setting up what I call accountability partners. I think white people who are in this work have to have other white people around them that have a really strong analysis and that will hold them in what we might call loving accountability, right? Like, I'm with you, we're connected. I have compassion and empathy, and what you did was off and you need to address it and repair it. And I'm not gonna, coddle that and make you feel better and tell you not to worry about it, right? So hopefully you have white people you can talk to and they can help give you feedback. And also, ideally, there are people of color in your life who are willing and have agreed to offer you that feedback. I definitely have people in my life who have agreed, and I pay them for their time, or I donate to a cause that the racial justice cause they have chosen. So for example, if Ron and I become friends and I'm like, Ron, I got to talk through something with you, would you be willing to talk through it with me? Or can I check this out? Or, and Ron agrees. And then I would also say, may I donate for the time you spent to a racial justice organization? So it's acknowledging that you are being given something that is valuable and should not be just expected. And then just keep doing your own work. Just read everything you get your hands on. Do Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy workbook. There's just so much good resource out there today.
Yeah, I want to share an experience I had here in Savannah in the public school system. So I was taking my daughter to first grade. This happened last year. And so I'd drop her off and pick her up from school. So one day I went to pick her up from school, and I saw, the teachers and, the staff leading a line of kids from the school to walk across the street. And they had the kids holding on to a rope. And in the back of the line was a police officer, right? So when I walked up on the scene, it just, something visceral just happened. It just struck me. I was just like, I just thought it was like so inappropriate. So I went over, and the first adult I came to was a teacher. I said, look, you see that little girl right there? That's my daughter. I'm here to pick her up. I don't ever want to come back here to pick her from school and see her at the end of a rope. Can you just not do that, right? She said, well, that's just our policy. That's just the way that we do it. And I snapped. I said, well, no, you're not going to do my daughter. I'll pick her up in school if I have to, but you're not going to bring her out that way. And so I went to the back of the line and I grabbed my daughter to walk her across the street. And the police officer in the back said, sir, what's the problem? I said, it's no problem at all. I said, I just explained to the teacher up here, this is my daughter. I don't want her being led across the street on a rope. Simple as that. And the police officer said something, inappropriate, and I kind of snapped back. She said, well, as long as she's going to school, she's going to be on the rope. And I just kind of lost it for a minute. But nevertheless, I walked her across the street and took her home. By the time I got home, the principal called and said that she was told there was a problem. What was the problem? I told her basically what happened and how I thought it was insensitive, racially insensitive. So here in Chatham County, you're a principal, you're a teacher, you should understand, at the outset that, Black people have a long history with ropes and they have meaning, right? And I just thought it was incredibly insensitive to have primarily a bunch of Black kids being led across the street on a rope. What was the point of that? She said, sir, well, we do it for their safety. I said, well, that just doesn't make sense to me because, if you can teach them to hold on to a rope, you can teach them to hold on to each other's hand. I just think it's totally insensitive. But the interesting part to what you said about being willing to kind of accept the input and having someone that can kind of hold you accountable, she was not receptive at all. And even though I was saying, look, I'm not trying to change the way you do things, but for my daughter, I will just pick her up, in the office after school, if this is the way that you have to do it, right? So she said, well, I can talk to the other parents, right, and see what they think, right? And at this point, my patience is really running out. So I said, well, look, I really don't care what the other parents think. I've told you what I think and how I'd like you to interact or not interact with my daughter, right? So to make a long story short, a couple of days later, they changed the policy. I got a call. But when I went to pick up my daughter, I had to kind of engage with, the police officers who, I guess, according to their protocol, they had to make sure there's no risk of future incidents or anything like that. But to me, it was just one of those incidents where it was just like incredible insensitivity and lack of willingness to even try, to understand, a perspective that was different from her own, which, by the way, I thought she should have understood at the outset.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, there's a few things that really jump out at me, and one is what an incredible opportunity for them to learn something that they didn't know, right? So rather than come at it as if you're off, to have the humility to say, oh, I didn't think about that, or I wasn't aware of that, or could you say more? Could you help me understand that? Yes, ideally we would be taught our history and I wouldn't need you to help me understand that. But if you're one of the few Black families at that school, what an incredible, again, opportunity for them to learn. So that's one piece. The other one, of course, is checking with the other parents, which she's missing the racialized dimension of that. And let's say there were 4 other Black parents and 2 didn't mind or 3 didn't mind and you minded. Then what they've set up there is the good people against the difficult people. So that's something
Right.
else that white people often do is you didn't like what I said, and then I go find somebody else who's Black who didn't mind. And so now they're the good one and you're the troublemaker. That came up for me when she said she checked with the other parents, besides missing the point that it was racialized. But also I had tension through that entire story around the police officer, that
Yeah.
those kind of incidences end with people dying. When you got the call, I didn't know if you were going to be approached as if you had caused trouble. All of that is in the air. And these are the different realities we live in. And I think that's a great example of something that a white person may not see as explicitly racist, but it caused a lot of distress for you.
Right. And I would expect that to be perceived as overreacting. But for
Well,
me, it was meaningful.
No.
And, I wasn't going to have my daughter kind of slowly indoctrinated with that type.
Yeah.
At least that was my thinking.
No, I hear you.
Jenny, you have another question?
I think this one goes nicely after the one we asked before is, how can a person of color respond to those who are feeling fragile and challenging the feelings of the person of color?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. And I'm always a little sheepish to give advice to what people of color should do or how they should handle our white fragility, but a couple strategies. One is just to, stay firm and withdraw from the situation if you don't want to continue to be subjected to somebody going round and round with you, negating your experience. Another strategy is to enlist a white person who does understand and can talk to that person, right? I mean, many of us who are white want to anoint ourselves as allies. Well, then show up as an ally. So let's say that person came to me and said, this white person just doesn't get it. They won't listen to me. Will you talk to them? Because they're probably going to be a little less defensive with me challenging them. Doesn't mean it's easy, but probably I could get a little further because we have a shared experience. So those are 2 ways I can. In the moment, though, to say to somebody, don't be defensive, well, has that ever worked in your life?
Be defensive.
So sometimes okay, let's just take a break. I'm going to ask you to just sit with it. I don't want to go round and round with it. A little bit like you really stood your ground in that situation. But wouldn't it have been powerful if another white parent had said, yeah, absolutely. I hadn't thought about that. That's not okay with me. I don't want to participate in that. Thank you for bringing it up. That would have really been supportive.
Right. I have a question. This one was from my friend Ann, who I'm sure is on the call. The question is, how do we switch the prevailing narrative of focusing on the targets of oppression to focusing on the specific institutional agents of oppression? And would that help move the needle more towards racial justice?
Well, I would like to believe that is what I'm trying to do. White Fragility is a book written by a white person to white people, and to try to help us understand what it means to be white, how not understanding what it means to be white causes harm, that's not benign or neutral. We have to raise one another's consciousness and awareness and work with each other. as I say that, I don't believe white people will ever understand racism if we do not listen to Black people and follow their lead. But we can't only listen to Black people and continually offload all the weight of this onto Black people, right? Like, well, you teach me, you have a problem, you solve it. I am your problem. And I need to be at that table also grappling with the role that I play.
Yeah, and here's a question, I guess, for me though. But even isn't all of that kind of consistent with the some of the strategies to maintain like white supremacy? And bear with me for a second. But my one observation, I had some time ago is that one of the ways that white supremacy works to perpetuate itself is by controlling, kind of the narrative. It's like you have to be in control of every narrative, the string, even the themes of every narrative, and I've seen it kind of play out. So I've seen, basically descendants of slave owners who run museums and heritage sites that focus on, the slave experience or the African American experience, which I always thought was pretty audacious. But and that's just kind of in that spirit. But I mean, even beyond, like just in terms of media, global media, for example, right? We'll see, largely white male owned, dominated, controlled institutions basically blanketing, the airwaves with narratives, and even narratives that purport to be, anti-racist or, liberal or progressive or whatever. The bottom line is that they're controlling how those narratives get disseminated, how they developed, and all of that. So it seems that one of the key characteristics of kind of the white supremacy toolbox, if you will, is the ability to kind of control and dominate the narrative.
Thanks for laying that out so clearly. I hope every white listener kind of took that in. And of course, I thought about my role in that very dynamic. So here's how it just stands, right? Well, let's just take it in that white people, as long as we're controlling the narrative, we are going to perpetrate our own perspectives and meet our own interests. Okay. This is a dilemma that, like, if I have finally reconciled as a both end, right? So it invokes Audre Lorde's beautiful quote, "The master's tools." How do you dismantle the master's house when you only have the master's tools? So I'm very clear that my work centers whiteness, right? Yet again, right in front of everybody. Here's a white person granted credibility and expertise, like pretty much everybody else put in front of us, as your daughter noted, who's granted authority, and on race, no less, right? And conscious or not, it's reinforcing, right? Something. It doesn't stand alone. And to not use this position and this platform to break with white solidarity, to challenge myself and other white people in the specific and unique way that I can do that as a white person, for me, that would not be acceptable either. And in a curious way, whiteness stays centered by never being named or marked as a position, right? As a perspective and a limited one. So yeah, I try to do that in a way that's as accountable as possible. I'm not trying to teach anybody about Black people. I'm trying to teach us about ourselves and ourselves in relationship to Black people and other people, and the things that we say and do, realizing it, that just keep this, cycle going on. But it's a dilemma. I hear you.
Yeah. Another question from the audience, Jenny?
Yes. So one question is, how would you suggest white people start to work in anti-racist advocacy?
I six, you want to start by never seeing yourself as done or arrived or as woke. I don't call myself an ally. That's not for me to say. That's for Ron to say if he thinks I'm behaving as an ally in any given moment. So you start with that kind of humility, but also with the courage to go and engage and struggle. And then you get yourself involved in things that are ongoing. So there are two I'll mention. I mentioned Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy Workbook. I love that because it takes you through a daily practice. So it's a book you do rather than just read. Dr. Eddie Moore has a 21-day racial equity challenge. You can do that in a team or with the group. My daughter did it with her work team in her workplace. Surge showing up for racial justice. There's lots of organizations. Whatever it is, you need it to be ongoing and sustained. Since I'm talking about books, I want to offer just an incredibly powerful one for Black people in particular and people of color, which is Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands. The Pathways of Racial Healing. He's a racial trauma expert. He's a Black man who specializes in racial trauma. It's a beautiful book that is also, as you are reading it, he's putting you through some exercises and some practices, and it's really great for a multiracial readership.
Can I add on to what you say? I think it's important for the white people in that category to not feel or think that they need the permission of Black people to do that work, right? I mean, we're just like anybody else, and and diverse in attitudes and thoughts and feelings and all of that, right? But it just seems to me that, and I kind of do this in my own life, is that if I think something is the right thing to do, I do it, and I don't kind of need permission, to do it, right? And all you can do is try and contribute, kind of like in a positive way, and kind of know that that's kind of the place that you're coming from. So
yeah, it gets a little tricky around whiteness though, because there's a kind of entitlement that we can have when we get into these spaces. So always be willing to get feedback.
Yeah, you should always be humble. I mean, everybody should, I think. But if you're convicted that you need to contribute in some kind of way, positive way, you should try and do that. And of course, you can be corrected along the way, but don't stop and feel like you need permission to do something that's you think is the right thing to do. That's good. Yeah. So I had another question from, okay, how can we, well, the question is written, it was, how can we as a city nation begin to break free of white privilege supremacy, right? And I guess I want to change it a little bit, since we kind of touched on that already a little bit. But, kind of given where we are and what we've seen, using this electoral session, or that we're kind of in the midst of right now, right? Which is, for me personally, is very disappointing, right? When we've had kind of the president that we've had, and to see almost half of the country, half of the voters, are still willing to give him another 4 years. So I wonder, like, what does that mean, for us as a nation? But then, like, what does it mean for racially oppressed people, right? That half the nation were not at least bit turned off, at least not enough to not vote for this person. Well, like, what does that mean kind of going forward? And just what do you make of it?
It's a huge, deep question. I don't have the answer in the sense of how do we get the whole society. And when I think about it like that, I tend to feel overwhelmed by how big that is. So then bring it down. Okay, what about me? What can I do? What's my role? And a key thing a couple key things. One is that in my experience, most white people think that being nice is enough. As if we're nice people, if we're friendly people, if I'm respectful to Ron, then that indicates that I'm not racist. Racism's not at play, and that's why I recommend books and projects that keep you going every day. Right? It's not a something you arrive at and now you're done. Wow. It's so clear that our work is not done and that we have to be a little bit like ripples in a pond with our family members and I always try to point the finger this way, not just this way, and speak to my own, what I've come to understand, that can help when you're talking across these divides with people in your life. The white nationalism is absolutely growing, and they are recruiting, and they're recruiting with teenage boys, white teenage boys in particular. So we can't be naive about what's going on, and so we have to pay attention to the young people in our lives. And I can imagine in your area, there are many ways to get involved, and I bet you Ron has lots of suggestions. But it's that kind of, we can't sit back. And
No.
yes, it's overwhelming. Yes, I'm discouraged. But as a white person, I cannot be hopeless. I mean, because what happens when I feel hopeless? I give up, and what does that do? Ultimately serves, my position within it. So how Black people navigate hope, I don't know. But as a white person, I don't get to go there.
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth, different. It's like a pendulum. Sometimes I'm almost optimistic, and other times I'm almost totally in a state of despair.
Yeah.
One part of your book that kind of moved me toward the despair part of the pendulum. I forgot what chapter it was. I think it was entitled Anti-Blackness, and you quoted one author, I forgot the name, who said that the trigger for white rage was Black advancement, right? And that was disturbing to me because I kind of remember, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where, Black community developed despite the odds, and it was somewhat prosperous and was basically destroyed by the surrounding white communities, right?
Yeah.
So it made me think of that, and I'm saying to myself, well, certainly in 2020, that's not the trigger for white people broadly. I mean, no doubt that for some white people that's a trigger, right? But I don't want to believe that that's generally true. So moving back to the other side of it.
So I was quoting Carol Anderson, who wrote, she's a Black woman. She won the National Book Award for that book, which is called White Rage. And it's brilliant. And I do think that for eight years of Obama, it is triggered where we are right now. To follow Obama with this, that's to me not coincidental, that there was there was a kind of resentment just below the surface that he gave permission to express. And it's been expressed. So I'm sorry for that caused despair. I was quoting Carol Anderson.
Yeah.
I highly recommend her book, though. It's powerful. Yeah. She also
I'll have to get it.
One Vote. She's brilliant. Read everything Carol Anderson writes.
Okay. Okay, Jenny, question from the audience. Let me know when we're running out of questions.
Okay, we have plenty.
Okay.
So this is an interesting question, and it's interesting for me because I do a lot of public school advocacy. And the question is about how we teach history in school, and how can we encourage accountability to teach a more well-rounded version of our history in our school system.
All right, we need a revolution in many of our institutions. And I actually think the institution of schooling is one of the major bellies of the beast. to be of the reproduction of white supremacy. I'm just going to say it. Schools efficiently and effectively reproduce racial inequality, and they sort children into unequal places in society. And I think we all know that, or we wouldn't care what school our children go to. But do we care? Who do we ever care, right? And I used to be a professor of education. So I was in teacher training, and I would stand in front of, well, the program was 97% white, and we were 10 miles from a city that's about 57% Black and Latino or Latinx. And I would just look out over these white students and just see the whole thing reproducing itself. And of course, that's just the teachers, curriculum, funding, location, on and on and on. Okay, not to add to despair. But when I say we need a revolution, well, until we get one, I really think that if you cannot integrate an anti-racist analysis into your teaching, you're not qualified to teach in today's schools. That's just it. And you're not, if you can't do that as a professor, you're not qualified to teach students, and certify them to be able to teach. I think organizations have to have that idea too. If you cannot engage in these issues with some complexity and nuance, with some openness, then you're not qualified to work here. That would be my dream. And the same goes for teachers. So, like a lot of these questions, there's not an easy answer. But I would start with teacher education. Because maybe that's my field. But no, we don't know our history. That's a huge part of the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think education really needs to be totally overhauled. I I remember coming up and being, a good student and getting into adulthood, being in the military, and finally starting to do some independent reading. And, I discovered, a bit about, Africa and African-American history, US history, and all those things, and was just shocked at my level of ignorance about the topic, because, and I was shocked because I was, pretty much told all my life I was a good student, and good grades and all of that. And I should know these things, right? So, and it hasn't changed, much. So, I definitely think that education is like one of those strategic areas to address. And so people ask, like, what can I do? If you have a penchant for, education reform, there you go, right? But on a positive note, just looking for something positive. So, they're kind of key institutions in society, right? That either are, I guess, racist, let's just use that term, or anti-racist, right? So you have corporate America, I think, has probably absorbed much of this, or more of this probably than some of the other sectors of our society. And you can, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's my take, having spent some 17 years in, well, actually 20 plus years in corporate America. The military may have absorbed some of it, right? Because they have a diverse, workforce, so to speak. Education, I think, probably hasn't. And I don't think the legal system, has really at all. In fact, I think it's just been a staunch, kind of racist institution. So when you look at it, right, you look at the range of kind of those key areas within our society that kind of can, really have huge impactful roles. Like, where do you see the bright spots? Like, what's like really kind of, and this is probably over the top word, but in the forefront.
No, I mean, in some ways, I wish you had framed it as to get us out of despair. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, like what's in the vanguard?
There are people who, like myself, who've been in this work for several decades. And the fact that the concept of systemic racism is in the mainstream is heartening and incredible. I remember a time when there was no space whatsoever to question capitalism. And then I think the Occupy movement made room to at least question that, particular forms of democracy. Now there's some room to question them because we've had candidates that are democratic socialists and so forth. And the fact that we have now the ability to talk about systemic racism, and it just cannot be underestimated the impact of that. That it moves us away from this good, bad, either or simplistic idea that enabled us to deny it for so long. That of the top 10 books on the New York Times bestseller nonfiction list, most of them are going to be about race. That's just unheard of, right? So at the same time that we see an amplification in, the white nationalist movement, we're also seeing amplification in people's awareness and activism. I mean, one of those books is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Kendi, and he's really clear that it has to result in policy change. And if your outcomes are not changing, then your policies are racist. I mean, he's just really blunt about it. If people are equal, if nobody's inherently inferior, then racism is the only explanation for Black people consistently at the bottom. And we start with ideas, right? We start with concepts. People often roll their eyes at theory. We all operate in the world from a theory, from a map, right? About how the world works. And when you change that map or that theory, you change how people behave in the world. So I see that as heartening.
Yeah, at least we're talking about it. We're analyzing, we're thinking.
Defund the police is it like, it doesn't mean it's not controversial, but I can't even imagine you could even begin to say that. Angela Davis wrote Abolish Prison how many decades ago, and she was so far out there on that, and now it's a reasonable idea.
Okay. Did you know that one of the things that happened yesterday was that California voted down their Proposition 16, which would have allowed affirmative action in public employment, admission to public universities, and I think one other space, right? I learned about it today in the paper, and I was surprised because, I've always had this impression of California being more liberal than the rest of the United States, but I was wrong. I don't know. You care to comment on kind of that perception versus reality?
I mean, I am thinking about your point earlier about controlling the narrative and how important it is to control the narrative. And so I think the narrative about affirmative action being special rights and unnecessary and so on has been really effective. I have a slide in my presentation, so it's like this long of a list of anti-Blackness. And it starts with, 300 years of enslavement, and it comes all the way into voter suppression, and I mean, into the present. And still somebody will say, but what about affirmative action? A toothless program that it has not accomplished, anything near its goals. As somebody other than me once said, when you're used to 100%, 98 feels oppressive.
Interesting. Yeah.
So
imagine.
When you think you deserve everything, then anything that is shared will seem unfair to you. But as far as California, but it is a huge state, and there's a high concentration of wealth. And yes. One of the other really important things that controlling the narrative has done is we're at a time in history where more wealth is concentrated into fewer hands than ever before in recorded human history, right? And where are the average white person's attention been drawn to? Immigrants, people, poor people on welfare, right? Yeah. And so as long as you can direct people's attention, this is why eliminating racism is in everybody's best interest. This is
it clearly is. To me, that's one of the most remarkable things about this whole dynamic is that America would certainly be much more prosperous if we didn't have, you know, these limitations dealing with race, right? It's just, it's almost, it's totally illogical, right? And it just kind of makes me think that, okay, well, maybe there's something not rational, you know, that's kind of behind and driving this whole thing and keeping it, you know, so prevalent. But yeah, I mean, even reparations, it's amazing to me that people can't really discuss seriously reparations for descendants of Africans who toil as slaves in this country for centuries, and then experienced, you know, Jim Crow and discrimination, which really that whole time you're talking about affirmative action for white people. I mean, that's pretty much what you had, to the point of giving away land, you know, that we didn't own. So I mean, that's just the history. That's the truth of it, right? So I'm like, in that context, you mean to tell me that you don't think it's appropriate to even discuss, you know, reparations in some form or another, right? Which, by the way, if it was granted, really, at the end of the day, who's it going to benefit? It's going to benefit, you know, the owners of capital in this country. I mean, people are going to spend the money. It's going to go right back into the same system. And at the end of the day, they're going to be probably the bigger beneficiaries than the direct recipients. It just makes no sense to me. But, you know, I understand that's a topic that, you know,
Well,
people
this is,
have feelings about.
I do think racism is irrational. I think white people are very irrational on race. And that's why I think it's like so absurd that we position ourselves as the objective arbiters of whether you know, racism is legitimate or not, whether your experience is legitimate, where we are the least objective, the most invested, and the most emotional and irrational on this topic. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Jenny, next question.
So related to that, related to what you were just talking about, I've had a few questions from people who want to know how to approach the conversation about racism with racist family members or, you know, racist friends, and how to bring it up without putting them on the defensive.
Yeah, so there's a few strategies, right? I mentioned one earlier, and that well, maybe just to start for us to get our courage, because I find family the most challenging. We have a lot of baggage with family, and so there's all these dynamics. But to not raise these issues is to collude, especially when things get said that are problematic. Those things cannot be said without any accountability, without your silence and your tacit approval. So get the courage, and then try to point your finger this way again rather than that way. So sometimes I'll start by you want to bring down the defensiveness. So you say, hey, I know, I can relate. I've had that thought myself. Or I've wondered about that too. All right, bring it down and say, but I've had the opportunity through this course I took or book I read or conversation I had, whatever, to get another perspective on it. And I realized, and then you give your insight. It's hard to argue with your insight. It doesn't mean they won't, but you're not telling them what to think. You're sharing what you've come to realize. And even if they reject it, for just that moment, they had to hear a counter narrative. But more importantly, you're in your integrity. I do this, I try to tell myself, this is for my healing. This is for my breaking with white solidarity. This is so I can go to bed tonight and be in my integrity. I hope they shift as a result, but that's not my goal. My goal is not to make sure they agree with me. I hope that's an outcome, but my goal is to be in my integrity, and to offer at least something maybe they hadn't heard. And then to understand that things percolate. Sometimes in the moment, somebody can't show you that got in a little bit, but they're thinking about it. So that's one strategy. Another is timing. I know my sister, for example, really well, and I know when she's open and when she's not. And so I wait to bring something up, or I come back later and I say, hey, you know, I've been thinking about what we were talking about yesterday. something's been bothering me. I'm not sure that this is what you meant, but I just want to, just in that super kind of like, usually the person's like, oh, what? Yeah, sure. What was it? And then when they're calmer, then you raise it again in a non-accusatory way. Those are some things you could do.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Jenny, you have another one?
I have
Jenny?
another question I wanted to ask
Sure.
from the audience, and that is about reparations and what you feel about reparations, how you think they should be calculated.
I think much smarter people than I have looked at this. I think, I hope everybody's read Ta-Nehisi Coates's The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic. This is, of course, I support reparations, but this is a moment where it kind of hooks to something we were talking about. Don't wait for permission, get involved. And we have different strengths. Calculating that would not be my strength. In my own way, of course, I donate a percentage of my income to racial justice organizations. This is a pro bono conversation we're having now. As I mentioned earlier, I pay the people of color in my life who offer accountability to me, and so forth. So there are ways that I try to be in my integrity. There's also in my city, Seattle, it sits on the ancestral territories of the Duwamish, and the Duwamish have been fighting for recognition for a very long time, and they keep being denied. I pay a land tax that supports the Duwamish people, it supports their longhouse. It's a form of reparation in terms of indigenous genocide and land theft. So there may be smaller, more local things folks can do to be in their own personal integrity around that.
We have about
Yeah,
10 minutes left. Ron, do you have any final questions you want to ask?
Yeah, I want to get you to expound, if you will, Robin, on this story in your book. I thought was pretty interesting and compelling. It's kind of one of the things that kind of struck me in a different context, where you talk about Jackie Robinson breaking the barrier, the racial barrier in baseball, and how kind of perspective, right? The way it's typically presented versus the way it could logically be seen, probably more accurately seen.
Yeah, well, I guess I can share that example, assuming not everybody's read the book.
Yeah.
And again, we're back to a theme, which is controlling the narrative, right?
Mhm.
So if you ask most people, so what did Jackie Robinson do? Most of us would say he broke the color line. I mean, that's kind of the tagline that goes with it. He was the first Black man who played in the major leagues. And so my area of scholarship is discourse analysis. So if we think about that framing, it makes Jackie Robinson an exception, right? An exception to his group. He was the one who finally had what it took to break through. So I actually literally get an image of ticker tape, and he's running and running, and finally he busts through, and he's amazing and so forth. And of course he is amazing. And of course he did endure incredible racism. But imagine the difference, right? Subtext, credit to his race, right? More than others. Imagine if the story went like this. Jackie Robinson was the first Black man that whites allowed to play Major League Baseball. Because it wasn't actually up to Jackie Robinson, right? He alone didn't break through the color line. If we didn't say he could play, he couldn't play. It wouldn't matter how good he was. He step out onto the field, he's removed by the police. So the reason I want us to tell it for me, the truer way is one that it doesn't do that exception piece again, but it also is really honest and direct about our history. And I need role models too. Clearly there was organizing behind the scenes, or that wouldn't have happened. So, what were those best practices? Who were those role models for me as a white person? What did we learn from that? That doesn't set us up to think, and racism in sports ended that day. Now, I'm glad you brought it up, because there was a critique that said that denies him agency. That broke my heart a little bit, because of course I do not mean to deny him agency. And I want to acknowledge that I can't imagine what he endured. But he didn't have complete agency, right? There is a structure there that he had to navigate, and to not identify that structure is the problem for me.
Yeah, and I think it's important to state that there were many other players just as talented, or maybe even more talented than he was at that time and before,
Yes.
who didn't, kind of get that designation, right?
Yeah.
But when I read the story, it made me think of the time I was reading the story of Rosa Parks to my youngest daughter, and I pretty much had the same kind of take on it, because I'm like, certainly, there were many Black people who refused to give up their seat on the bus before Rosa Parks, right? And I thought it was important that she understood, that, and not kind of be left with this suggestion that up to that point, there were no Black people who were courageous enough not to give up their seat before Rosa Parks.
Yeah, there's another piece in there too, which is that she was an activist, and that was a very strategic choice.
Yes.
And again, you strip away an activist, right? Like all of the organization that happens for those moments, you take that away, and then you make one person special, right? And they are, and they're not isolated.
And to your point, is not to take away anything from Jackie Robinson or Rosa Parks or other firsts, so-called firsts. It's not to take away anything from them, individually or personally. It's just to kind of give a more complete, accurate picture, which I think, is more helpful to all of us.
Yeah.
Well, we have about 5 more minutes. Is there anything you'd like to, anything more further that you'd like to share with us in the remaining few minutes?
Well, I don't know all the questions on people's mind, but there is one last thing I'd love the opportunity to speak to, and that is some form of why should we be listening to a white person at this moment when we're really trying to amplify Black voices and Black Lives Matter is being elevated. And so let me speak to that. I did a little bit earlier in that, please, my voice should never be the only voice. But it isn't a zero-sum game where, if you listen to me or read my book, you can't or won't listen and read many, many other books. There's just a particular angle that I can offer that's different, and it's one of many, many, many. So hopefully that is useful. We talked about some things that are hard, and we talked about despair. But let me say that this is the most liberating, transformative, beautiful journey I could ever imagine being on. Painful at times, of course. But I have relationships, I have understandings and awarenesses I never would have or could have without this work. It's not just hard. Yeah, it's not just painful. It's not just guilt-ridden. It's beautiful. The way my life was set up, I would never know someone like you, Ron. I would never come to admire or love you even. And I would never have felt any loss about not knowing, loving, or admiring you. I mean, that's the loss of white supremacy for white people. That's one of them. So thank you for, honoring me with your time in this conversation.
Well, thank you for honoring us. I mean, I found your book to be just incredibly insightful. I actually do think there's value in the fact that it's coming from, a white person brought up in, this culture. As you yourself, noted that there were many who've tried to speak through us through the ages and tried to convey, some of these ideas. But I think the way that you've done it is just, just compelling, just incredibly insightful. And I think it's of immense value to society, to our culture. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. This is and was pro bono. I want the audience to know that. And we are very grateful here at the Beach Institute.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks to everybody. And thanks you, Jenny, for all you did to make it happen.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night,
We really
everybody.
appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Talk later.
Okay.